if we try and tie it down too soon to nerve impulses, we actually just end up with more data on neurophysiology, and the consciousness itself disappears.
The brain adds on naming, and it adds on conditioning to what one is seeing. For instance, when one sees a book, it's not necessarily a book, actually it's just a pattern of light falling on the retina, producing electrical signals which are interpreted by the brain. The terminology book, the idea book, comes from our conditioning and our understanding as we've built it of our internal model.
We can measure nerve impulses in squids and in hundreds of kinds of animals, but it tells us nothing about their consciousness. We don't know whether they're conscious or not. And also a lot of the nerve activity in our own brains is unconscious. So I think it's better to start from the phenomena of consciousness.
In a way, from one point of view, all of our experience is hallucinatory or illusory.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think we construct the world around us. We've got evidence from the senses, but we're really living in a kind of a fiction, in a sort of story that we create.
So the action of speaking with our mouth closed and talking to ourselves, but without actually talking to ourselves, is an hallucination. The hard problem, to use Chalmers' words, is the question of how physical processes in the brain give rise to subjective experience. I tackle this hard problem by spelling out a difference between what I mean by mundane hallucinations and real virtuality. Internal signals give rise to mundane hallucinations when reintegrated by the brain's virtual sensor. By real virtuality, I mean the experience by the virtual sensor of externally originating information received via the special cellular sense organs, visual, auditory and so on. Mundane hallucinations comprise normal dreams, not extreme night terrors, and the auditory hallucination of an internal voice speaking to yourself without opening your mouth. I make a distinction between those and the deficit hallucinations, phantom vision, tinnitus, schizophrenia, LSD experiences and so on.
Very often there is overlapping of the two perceptual types, internally and externally originating. We can be reading the page of a book, external object, whilst internally generating a mundane hallucination of ourselves as narrator, reading the words.
What our hallucinated or internally generated imaginary voice is saying, its intentional content or meaning if you like, depends on background processing elsewhere in the brain.
In the dream case, the visual cortex, or some other brain area, is generating sensory information or signals that resemble externally originating sense information.
The pineal eye grew up with the brain from the very earliest times, so it's reconstructed from this engram or trace memory directly because of the shape of the structures embedded deep within the brain, the very reptilian core and limbic parts of the brain. If you can think of a bus conductor who has a machine that he drops coins into, and there are different size slots through which different coins fall, so that the larger coins are all sorted into the same column and the smaller coins, they roll down. As they roll down, they fall into the shape that fits that particular coin. Now, you might say that that bit of apparatus is intelligently sorting the coins into the different categories, but in fact there isn't an intelligence, an active intelligence there.
Although it might superficially seem possible to observe a whole, this is never the case. You can only see the whole in reference to the background.
What it really is a sheet with a hole chopped as a triangle, and another sheet behind it with a black circle. Gaps at the extremities or edges are perhaps less obvious than gaps in the centre of a body. If this structure had always been this shape, then it would just be an irregular shape, whereas if it had been an integral rectangular object at some point, then we can say that this area is a gap. This is the integral donut and this is the bun with the missing centre. Identical in all respects except for the way the history and the way they were manufactured.
We may mistake this whole for the background and the procession of events and perceptions seen through it.
And if I was walking on a street in Paris and held up this to my eye and looked through it, I might see the Eiffel Tower or any object at all.
We cannot see a whole itself, but it is necessary sometimes to have a whole in order to see through.
So what this seems to suggest is that pure disembodied consciousness is not possible. No distinction could exist between this disembodied consciousness and its general surroundings.
This whole has definite location and spatial boundaries, but is not composed of any physical stuff or form of energy. So the median eye seems to be another example of a non-physical entity whose existence cannot be reasonably denied, in the same way that a whole is non-physical but can be said to exist.
If the gap is imagined and movable, in other words, if we're selective, it's directable, it overcomes the limitations of its original template, the pineal eye. Sometimes it can be seen that a gap has both functional and physical elements. When some data is missing from a computer memory bank, signals but not substance have gone, but there's still a gap left.
The abstract process, abstraction meaning taking away from or abstracting from the environment that typifies human mental life, is modelled on processes once carried out by an actual physical cellular pineal sense organ.
The phantom pineal eye remains an integral part of the biosphere. Rather than merely being receptive to physical impressions made upon it, its scope is freer, allowing self-determination within the constraints set by the demands of the physical body.
Another example of a gap in the biosphere is that left by traumatic loss or amputation of a limb.
So a person who's had a leg cut off in an operation will feel that the leg's still there. And this is a problem in hospitals after amputation. Amputees often try and walk because it feels as if the leg's there and they fall flat on their face.
The relationship between the pineal gland and the phantom eye is analogous to the relationship between the phantom toe and the stump.
I think phantom limbs are to do with morphogenetic fields, which are the fields that shape the developing body.
I've given some thought to why evolution would think it worthwhile to retain these generally unpleasant feelings in limbs that have been lost in nature, and the possible reason, which I think, is that the earliest types of animals could regenerate limbs, so it was useful to retain the psychological awareness of how that limb functioned and the space that it would occupy to assist the limb to grow back into that space.
Phantom sense organs can occur as well as phantom limbs. Recently there has been some renewed interest in phantom vision cases. Cases of phantom vision have been recorded by science since the 18th century. Subjects report seeing an object, such as a house or person, in as clear detail as if the object was actually in front of them and their eyesight was unimpaired. Tinnitus, or auditory hallucinations following hearing loss, is a fairly common example.
And again, I mean, you can cut the eighth nerve, which is the auditory nerve, and you've still got tinnitus. So it can be evoked centrally by the brain itself.
MVT would suggest that the phantom pineal eye is congenitally arising, in other words, lost before birth, rather than from traumatic loss.
The trace or genetic memory for the pineal eye is still a current property, and that in fact in our own lifetime we actually develop and then lose a parietal skull opening.
The interaction of consciousness with the body occurs, I don't think, just through the pineal gland or even just through the brain. I think it's to do with the whole experience of our body. I think in a phantom limb experience, the consciousness of the limb is actually in the place where the limb seems to be, not inside the brain and then just projected to where the limb was.
Consciousness would still, as if it is a phantom pineal eye, as I would claim, would still carry on even if the pineal gland calcifies or is removed from the brain. The phantom pineal eye might be seen as perhaps a spotlight of consciousness.